All right, a quick few odds and ends when it comes to genetics. We're going to talk about nature versus nurture. So you maybe heard this discussion of, is it nature or is it nurture that decides kind of traits of a person? Nature is the idea of the genetic code, what's actually within you, right? Well, nurture is what happens to you in your lifetime. It can include things like social interactions, experiences, nutrition, opportunities or choices, that sort of thing. And there's always kind of been this discussion of, is it something that's in a person's nature or is it something that happened over time and has to do with their nurture? This is especially important when it comes to judging people for their actions or their character or what they do or whatever. Because if it's about nature, well, then kind of feel like the blame isn't as on them as if it's about nurture and kind of the things that have happened to them within their lifetime and the choices that they've made. One feels out of your control, nature, while the other one feels more in your control, which is the nurture aspect of things. So let's watch this identical twins video before we continue on. So what do you think plays more of a role in a person's personality? Genetics or upbringing? No wrong answers here. So at the end of the day, genetic information can change as a result of mutagens. I feel like I'm rushing ahead here. When it comes to nature versus nurture, this is something where it's still not clear cut, and it really depends on what we're talking about. Some things are very much nature, and in fact, more than you would probably think has to do with nature as opposed to nurture. Even things when it comes to your sense of humor has a lot to do with nature instead of having to do with nurture. There are actually accounts of people having switched at birth situations, right? Where two babies born at the same time were actually mixed up in the nursery because they looked very similar or whatever and went home with the wrong family. And they felt like they didn't belong in that family for their whole lifetime because essentially they just didn't share the same sense of humor, the same mannerisms, the same a lot of things, because so much about our personality actually is determined by genetics instead of being determined by nurture. Now, nurture, of course, plays a role. It does. It completely and totally does. But I think that as we learn more about genetics and genetic code and about how much it influences us, we realize actually more and more as time goes on how much nature and our genetics are at play in who we are, both obviously in how we look, right? And that's easy to understand. But also in our personality and how our brain works and all sorts of things. And even just looking at, going on a bit of a rant here, looking at the physiology of the brain, the different things that are in play when it comes to neurotransmitters and processes and synapse and everything. It's amazing the effect that all of these physiological things actually have on us. And our genetics play a massive role. Okay, we also need to talk about genetic mutations. Genetic information can change as a result of mutagens, so factors that cause mutations. Things like X-rays, UV rays, cosmic or gamma rays, radioactive decay, chemicals. So a lot of this fits into, and in fact, radioactive decay is actually kind of redundant with gamma rays or other X-rays or whatever, because it causes, again, rays, UV radiation that can cause damage to DNA. So ionizing radiation is what we call it. So essentially, if we have radiation or something that can actually cause a change in the DNA, so it actually mutates, obviously, or affects the DNA in some kind of way, then as a result, that can cause a mutation, or it causes a mutation, depending on what's there in that portion of DNA. I think I mentioned this before, but a lot of your DNA is just nothing. It doesn't actually code for anything, or it's not understood at this point what it actually does. It's just gobbledygook. And then we have, genes in there, right? But a lot of it is just nothing, just random bases that don't have any impact whatsoever on how our cells or our bodies or anything functions. But if a mutation does actually change something important in a gene, and there's different kinds of mutations. There's point mutations that change just one of the nitrogen bases, right? The A, T, C's or G's. And then you have frame shift mutations, I think they're called, where you kind of if you were to backspace on something, right? So if you backspace, then everything else shifts as well. So it's like a frame shift mutation. So it has wide effects. as opposed to a point mutation. But when I have mutations, they are often harmful. Most of the time they're harmful, but occasionally a mutation could actually bring some kind of benefit, right? It can actually cause that organism to end up functioning better, to have an advantage over other organisms. And then as a result, that mutation will pass on to offspring because it's more able to reproduce. Survival of the fittest, right? So if it's more able, based on its mutation, to be able to create offspring and reproduce, then that means that that will get carried on to further generations. So, I mean, we've all heard of the superhero that has these amazing mutations, and then as a result, it can do incredible things. I mean, that's the idea. Now, most of the time, almost all the time, mutations are not major or helpful or whatever. They could be a very small thing. And when we talk about mutations like the Hulk, I mean, it's just ridiculous, but you get the idea. It's still that something changes in DNA, and as a result, it actually could give an advantage, but most of the time it doesn't. Instead, it gives a disadvantage. And talking about disadvantages, let's talk about cancer. When mutations happen to DNA, cancer is one possible result. And basically what happens when we talk about cancer is that a cell keeps on dividing over and over and over with no checks and balances. So a cancer just basically is a cell that its DNA has been changed, so it thinks that it just needs to keep growing and reproducing and growing and reproducing, and it doesn't actually listen to the chemical signals to your body telling it to stop or for it to die or whatever. It just keeps on going and going and going. So it's the rapid division of cells that do not develop properly. And that's one example, obviously, of bad mutations that can occur because of mutagens. Okay, let's watch a quick video on this, okay, kind of going through and talking about cancer, and then go from there. Now, I will actually mention that when it comes to mutations that happen to your DNA, your body actually has these mechanisms that are meant to check DNA, to kill cells that have poor mutations. There's a lot of like fail-safes or things in place in your body to prevent mutations from actually having negative effects and from cancer growing and whatever. And actually some people have much better abilities in order to actually fight cancer and deal with mutations to DNA than others. And other people are more prone to cancers and mutations in their DNA. This is why doctors will ask about family history when it comes to cancers, is because some people have a better ability to deal with those mutations to their DNA than others, or they're more prone to mutations into their DNA. So again, we're talking about like genetic variants here, right, within our species. But if mutations do occur to the DNA, it can be passed on to the offspring if it's something that's advantageous or just actually doesn't matter or affect the viability of that person and its ability to reproduce. And as we have mutations that actually cause changes, well, then as a result, we have variation within our offspring. There was a really neat show that was out a while back. That was Stan Lee's Superhumans, and I'll see if I can find a link of kind of some of the interesting ones. And it was all about people who had these like abnormalities, these mutations that actually made them like superhumans. So they had just really neat abilities because of the mutations they had. So that's kind of something cool to check out. Rip Stan Lee. But it was a very neat and interesting show that I used to show in class as a bit of a filler on days when kids were tired out or whatever. So, hey, maybe we can find a full episode here or just watch a few clips. All right. Well, anyways, that's it. That's talking about mutations and cancer. Now that we've talked about things like genetics, DNA, etc. So, have a good rest of your day.